Happy Halloween! Today I want to share some scary stories of quilting disasters. You can relate. If you've had something terrible happen in your quilting journey, please share it in the comments below. I hope this doesn't freak you out too much. I'm Andy, and this is True Blue Quilts, a place to enjoy, experiment, and excel as you quilt. The number one horror story for any quilter would be bleeding on the quilt. That is a definite no-no. Of course, we have all been pricked by those sharp pins, so it pays to take a second and make sure everything is put away before you start stitching on that beautiful project. A common horror story is a rotary cutter injury. Remember to secure those blades before you set those sharp objects down. Wear closed-toed shoes and keep your fingers out of the way. We don't want any blood on our quilts. Another horror story that I have personally experienced is stitching right through my fingernail. Surprisingly, it didn't hurt as much as you might think, but it definitely scared the bejesus out of me as I was stitching along, and then, yikes, jerked my hand away. The needle had broken right off through the center of my thumbnail, so I quick washed it off, put the medical cream on it so it wouldn't get infected, and it healed up pretty well, but that was definitely a scary day. Probably the most horrific story I've ever heard, and this was a story I saw on the internet, was of a woman who had actually swallowed a pin. I'm sure you've seen or remember having your dresses or pants hemmed and people would have pins in their mouth like that. Well, this lady had actually been doing that and swallowed a pin. Terrible, terrible injury. She had to obviously have that surgically removed, something I would never ever dream of happening. So for all of you that keep those pins tucked right in your mouth, might be time to invest in a wrist pin cushion so that we don't have any quilting horror stories. Besides bodily harm, there are some quilting horror stories about what happens to the quilt after it's been made. Perhaps someone didn't appreciate your quilt very much and it became a dog bed. Oh, the horror of the quilt not being used. Well, at least the dog might love it. And another quilting horror story that probably ranks way up high is having the quilt colors bleed, especially if you're mixing white fabric with anything dark like a beautiful purple or red, and you throw it in the wash and those colors just run, and then all of a sudden you've got a pink and gray quilt. The best advice I can give for that is to invest in some type of color catching. They make almost like dryer sheets, but you actually put them in the wash, and those collect a lot of the color. Obviously pre-washing your fabric, especially those dark colors that you think are going to run. They also make commercial liquids that you put in the wash with those fabrics to set the color there. So do a little bit of research, and I hope none of these quilting horror stories ever happen to you. Enough of the scary stuff. Let's get back to creating some beautiful quilts. I've linked the tutorial for some star quilt blocks in the videos below. And don't forget to subscribe. I'm here every week with more quilting tips and tricks.